So I'm going to start out with just kind of the highlights of the biennial budget. Any budget is a quantification of your planned activities. It's plans with numbers, I think, is the way Nuria says it occasionally. And so that's really what we're talking about here. We have our planned activities, and then these are the numbers that support that. It supports our VTA strategic plan, and I'll go through that in just a moment. Excuse me. It incorporates the financial stability recommendations, and it also advances our capital programs and addresses our state of good repair needs. The budget was developed under a couple of frameworks. One was the strategic plan that I mentioned, and then also the Ad hoc Financial Stability Committee recommendations that were adopted by the board last December. In addition to that, I didn't list it up here because it kind of happens after we've really started the process, but the board priorities for 2019 that were stated in January, this budget also dovetails into several of those. The financial stability portion is addressed with the committee recommendations. Transportation innovation, we do now have an Office of Innovation that has been set up in our most previous reorganization that will look to ways to do innovative projects with Prospect Silicon Valley and other private entities in the region. Workforce development was also on there, and this budget does include an increase on education and training for our workforce. So speaking of the strategic plan real quickly, these are the core values which lead to great products and great people for our strategic plan, and they represent our ethics and code of conduct and guide the agency's decision-making process. This pyramid is meant to illustrate our strategic organization, and again emphasizes that great people are the foundation upon which great products are built, and through creation, leading, and collaboration, we are able to meet our goals and our strategic plan values. We fit in here in this middle box, well, middle part of the pyramid, if you will, is the 2-year budget, which is part of the process that gets us to great projects. Another portion of the strategic plan and goals are the business lines. There are 3: faster, frequent, reliable transit, delivering projects and programs, and transportation system management. And in the development of the budget, the divisions were asked to make sure that all of their submissions met one or more of these business lines, and all of the projects, capital projects that were submitted also had to have a nexus to one of these business lines, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later about the proposed capital projects and how they support these lines. All of those things, the financial stability and the strategic goals, really are overarching to all of the funds that we budget, and there are 8 different ones that we do, and I'll speak a little bit on each one of them. I'm going to start with transit. This is the operation, development, and maintenance of transit service in Santa Clara County. I always use my little dollar bill slide. I'm addicted to it. I can't stop. Every budget session I'd use this. Basically, the idea here is that there are competing uses for our dollars. The reality is we have a limited number of resources and an unlimited number of ways to spend them. The challenge is this is a zero-sum game. If you take something off of one corner, or excuse me, if you need to add to one corner, it has to come off of something else. There's only one pot of funds. A majority, as we'll see later, is sales tax funds that are used to fund the operating and capital budget for transit. Anything that's a recurring expense needs to be funded by a recurring funding source, and one-time funding sources are really only a good source for one-time expenditures. Failing to keep our assets in state of good repair has very negative impact on our future ability to receive grants, and we do try to strike a balance between the operating dollars and the capital dollars. Like I mentioned, the same sources are used for both. If you spend too much money on operating, your system becomes degraded and people don't want to use it. If you spend too much money on operating, you have bright, shiny new things, but you can't afford to move them around. Capital, I'm sorry. So I mentioned that this was one of the framework was the Financial Stability Committee recommendations. I'm on slide 10, by the way, for the people in the back who also don't have a screen in front of them if you're following along. So there were 3 near-term actions, mitigations that were approved by the board. The first was service delivery to implement the concepts of the originally planned Next Network to the greatest extent possible within the current level of service hours, and to also increase the ridership coverage ratio to 90-10 for the system. The second item was to index certain fares to inflation subject to an annual review and approval of the board. And the third was to offer voluntary retirement to eligible employees and to restructure departments where appropriate. So starting with the service levels, this chart represents the levels that are included in the proposed budget and also are the levels that are in the proposed new transit service plan that has been making its way through the advisory and standing committees after a very lengthy and robust public process. I believe the last standing committee will hear it this afternoon, and then it's scheduled to go to the board in May. This also, it's not specifically listed here, but one of the other tenets that happens in this new service plan is anytime you have big changes, you have, even though the end goal is increase in ridership, the initial change will tend to be a decrease because the lines that change, those ridership change right away, but you have a process of existing riders changing their riding habits and new riders coming on. So the other thing that this budget assumes is that the increase of ridership from the new plan, which is estimated to be between 7 and 9%, will take up to 2 years to solidify. I mentioned earlier about the sales tax revenues. It is, you'll see in a moment, upwards of almost 80% of our total revenues that go into the operating budget, and then also funds part of the local share of capital. 2 things important here. South Dakota Wayfair decision that was in the Supreme Court in June, which allows state to require out-of-state retailers to collect and remit sales taxes regardless of where they are located. Starting April 1st, California is requiring anyone who has over $100,000 of sales in the state with a minimum of 200 transactions to begin collecting those sales tax and remitting them to the state regardless of where they are located. There is an effort in the legislature to change that limit to 500,000 instead of 100,000, but that has not currently been passed. We asked for a range of scenarios from our sales tax consultant, and you can see here the range that they have given us from conservative to optimistic. We have chosen in the budget, as Raj mentioned, to take a more measured approach, and the budget reflects a conservative growth rate of 1.5%, and that does include also a conservative impact of the online sales.
There's just one thing I want to add to this. The Supreme Court ruling now allows all of the 50 states to collect sales tax on online sales. So that's beneficial to everyone, but however, for the state of California, 2 things. Amazon, the biggest online retailer, had already voluntarily complied to pay sales tax. So there is a benefit, but not that much of a benefit compared to other states. So that's why we have chosen a more conservative approach, notwithstanding the Wayfair decision by the Supreme Court. And the second thing that is specific to the special district, which we always received sales tax based on destination, not on point of sale. In other words, any goods, taxable goods that ship to our county, we did receive sales tax on it. Unlike the cities in the county, they are more point of sale based. So the impact of Wayfair on VTA is not that great compared to the impact on other cities and other states. I just wanted to note that. Thanks.
Thank you, Raj. Moving on to our assumptions and fares, the current budget assumes no change in the current fare pricing structure. We wanted to take a measured and thorough and thoughtful approach to changing our fare policy. So our plan is to bring the fare policy back to this board towards the end of this year, early 2020, with the proposed changes to index the fares to inflation. The plan here is that any resulting changes from that would not take effect any earlier than January of 21. As you may be aware, we have just instituted 2 years in a row we had a fare change in January, so this gives us a little time for that to settle in, if you will, before we implement any more changes to the fare structure. Labor costs as a service organization is also always going to be one of our bigger components. As Raj mentioned, the budget does not reflect any of the potential impact from labor negotiations that are currently underway or upcoming. It does reflect the changes from the recently approved SEIU contract. The ATU contract, as we said, is currently under negotiation, and both the AFSCME and TAEA contract expire in June, so those negotiations will be forthcoming. The budget does assume the pension and retiree health contributions based on the actuarial information, and there are no net change in the number of authorized positions. There is an increase of 6 positions in support of the 2 new multimodal stations and transit centers in Milpitas and Berryessa. There is also a decrease of 6 positions related to the early retirement incentive program and the recent reorganization. So the net is 0. So going into the revenues, this pie is just intended to show kind of the makeup here. And as I mentioned, the sales tax based, which is the 76.5 cent, the TDA funds, the portion of operating assistance that comes from Measure A, and the 2016 Measure B transit operations, that's 78% of the total revenues, so very susceptible to economic volatility. Moving to the expenses, the service delivery, as that's operations of the transit system, is the main point of this fund. So 79% is delivery of the service. We also have contracted services here, which includes paratransit and our regional partnerships with Caltrain, ACE, Highway 17, and Monterey and Salinas. And this also shows $35 million per year towards the local share of capital. Just breaking down the service delivery portion a little, as I mentioned, as a service delivery, labor is always going to be your number one highest cost. 73% of that service delivery piece of the pie is labor. The other pieces are materials and supplies, security, fuel and traction power, and then just miscellaneous other costs. So where does that leave us? So in FY18, we had a slight deficit of $5.7 million. Our current projection for FY19 is a $15.6 million positive balance, but I have 2 caveats to that. One is it includes a lot of one-time revenues that would have been, some of them would have been received in FY18, excuse me. A big piece of that is sales taxes. As I think most of you are aware, the California Department of Taxation and Fee Administration had some glitches, to be polite, to say the least, maybe I should say. And their third and fourth quarter, collections for FY18 were severely underreported. They have worked through all of that, and we have received those monies in FY19, so that's why the revenues look way out of whack in 19 compared to 18, and also compared to 20, if you think about it that way. We also had the 2016 Measure B legal lawsuit that was holding up our 2016 Measure B funding. Once that shook out, if you will, finalized in January, FY19 includes both the FY18 portion and the FY19 portion. So that's one reason that explains the larger amount of revenues and also the projection at this point. For FY20 and FY21, as currently presented, shows a small $2 million positive operating balance in 20 and $4 million in 21. But as you'll notice, those are all footnoted that 19, 20, and 21, none of them include the impact of labor negotiation outcomes. Raj mentioned there are some risks to this. Again, the labor negotiations, there are also several economic volatility, sales tax growth. Even though we've assumed a fairly conservative number, there's always the chance that turns out to be more optimistic than conservative. Diesel fuel prices is actually a little bit of a double-edged sword because we are a consumer of diesel. If the price goes up, that's harmful to our expenditures, but our STA funds are based on the sales tax on diesel, so we get more as the price goes up there. But I tried to do a little quick calculation this morning, and I think it hurts us more than it helps us if they go up. Yeah, STA funds. State Transit Assistance. Bad about I forgot that I hadn't already talked about that. Yeah, State Transit Assistance. And this is, just so you're full-on disclosure here, we've gotten state transit assistance for many, many, many years. On average, $10 to $15 million, depending on the year and the price of diesel, quite frankly. SB1, the passage of SB1, changed it from a flat cents on the gallon to a % on the gallon. Part of the goal was so that inflation was felt, we got the benefit of inflation, if you will. That change in SB1 has increased our annual STA funds to currently the projection for FY20 per MTC is about $40 million. So we were getting 10 to 15, now it's 40, so that's about 20 to 20 or 25 to 30 million more than we had been getting previously. The utilities, always a possibility. It's not a large portion of our budget, but because we do have traction power in addition to utilities that run our agency facilities, that is something that can have an impact. Healthcare costs is always a volatile unknown, if you will. We've made an assumption based on historical growth rates, but we won't know until the next enrollment period what the premiums actually are. And then I mentioned pension costs. Those can change also based on the market and how the investments do, quite frankly. The other, I mentioned the transit ridership, and which then ties into the fare revenues. If the ridership doesn't come back with the new plan as quickly as we'd hoped, it could come back faster than we hoped, but we have made an assumption and it could be different than that. Capital programs. So the proposed capital program budgets represent the planned spending to be incurred or committed in the next 2 years. The appropriation for these carry forward. They do not expire, unlike the operating budgets, which expire on an annual basis. We appropriate them all in FY20 in the first year of the 2 years just to facilitate administration. And these items were reviewed and recommended for approval by the Capital Program Committee at both a workshop in February and then at the action was taken at their March meeting. Start with the Transit Fund. This fund, as I mentioned, is the operating, development, and maintenance of transit service in Santa Clara County. This is the maintenance piece, if you will, and the state of good repair. We have quite a bit of equipment and infrastructure and facilities that need to be kept up and improved. Our latest capital asset replacement has a 5-year projection of needs of upwards of $750 million. This 2-year capital budget funds 71 projects for a total of $217 million in the categories that are listed here on this chart. And then on chart 25, I break them down by project type. You'll notice that a large portion is replacement and state of good repair. I will say also that a portion of the safety and security items are called out here as safety and security, but they are also could be categorized as replacement of state of good repair. Some of the major examples, if you will, for state of good repair, we have electric bus procurement, replacing the existing diesel buses. light rail overhead, catenary rehab and replacement for $16 million. The electric bus procurement that I mentioned is $25 million of that 116. We have a rail rehab project for just under $15 million, and also a rehab of the light rail system elevators and escalators for about $9 million. We kind of chart this pie a little differently, and the funding sources. We do, to the greatest extent possible, try to leverage grant funding. So what you see here is that $219 million roughly of projects. $99 million of those come from federal grants, 35 from state grants. We also have a piece of 2016 Measure B that funds projects in the transit fund, and then the remaining $60 million comes from VTA local, which is the sources that I referred to earlier when we talk about funding the local share of capital. This is where that funding goes. Moving to the Measure A program, these are projects that are, well, the program itself, excuse me, is responsible for the planning and completion of projects in the specific categories that are detailed in the ballot. The current 2-year budget includes augmentations to 3 projects that are listed here. These are currently the only ones that need additional budget in the next 2-year period. There are existing projects that are ongoing that can do the next 2 years with their existing budget. The VTA highway program is really more than just highways. It's really multimodal. It's the planning and completion of highway projects, expressway projects, express lanes projects, bike and pedestrian, and then complete streets. There are 29 projects in the 2-year budget for this program for a total of just under $283 million. And the funding source for these, the primary source, 78% of it is from 2016 Measure B, and then there are some other and a little bit of federal and state money. The other here tends to be cities or the county. A lot of it is part of the 10% match that's required for the 2016 Measure B funds. I mentioned earlier about the strategic goals, and the projects were asked to make a nexus to at least one or more of the business lines. And just as a reminder, these are the 3 business lines that we have as part of our strategic goals. The table on slide 33 shows each of the funds and the number of projects, and then what percentage of those projects support each of those business lines. You'll notice these won't add to 100 because some of the projects actually support multiple business lines. There are some of them that actually support all 3 business lines. So we do feel that we have a good nexus to what we're doing is in support of what we plan to do and say we're going to do. As I mentioned earlier, there are 8 funds that we do for. I'm just going to do real quickly through these, just one slide on each program. We talked about the capital piece of the 2000 Measure A program. For ease of administration, and maybe that's not the right word, but I call this the operating budget for Measure A. That's not exactly accurate. It's more like the non-project budget. Primarily, this is the operating assistance that goes to transit, which is one of the items of the 14 that are on the ballot, and then also debt service for the borrowing that we've done to accelerate the projects. Slide 36 is the Congestion Management Program. We are also the Congestion Management Agency for the county. The highlights of this 2-year budget in FY20 includes a one-time surcharge to member agencies for funding of the vehicle miles travel tool. It also includes a 3.5% increase in member agency fees in each year. The Joint Development Program continues the efforts to create mixed use, mixed income, TOD, transit-oriented development, and has both an operating component, which is just kind of the year-to-year, day-to-day maintenance of that program, and then we also do have a capital piece that we appropriate that's for site-specific work, and it's purposely done through the capital budget because then it can carry forward because those things tend to have multi-year lives. The Express Lanes program, the highlight here is we are anticipating to open Phase 2 in the fall of 2019. So this includes both additional revenues and expenses from that extended operation. It also includes the beginning of principal payments. This fund took out a loan of up to $24 million to help pay for the Phase 2 construction costs. So starting a little bit in FY20 and then starts to really kick in FY21 is the payback of that loan payment, and the source of payback is 100% from the toll revenues. 2008 Measure B is for the operating and maintenance of BART program. That agreement with BART is currently being finalized, so what we have chosen to do at this point in time is to only include the continuation of current costs and the support positions that had previously been approved in the budget and will need to be filled prior to operations. Once we know more of what the actual need is based on when the O&M is approved, then we will address that additional appropriation at the same time that we address approval of the O&M. Last but not least is the 2016 Measure B program. As we discussed earlier, the legal challenge was resolved. This is a program budget, and so this appropriation carries forward. It does not expire, and the budget of $442 million for the 2 years reflects the programming and allocation that was approved at the April board meeting. The table on slide 41 is also a little larger and easier to read on page 3 of the budget document. Shows each of the funds and both the operating and capital portions and how much the appropriation would be requested. Just a next steps kind of thing. We are doing community meetings at the first part of May, one in North County, one in South County, and one in downtown San Jose. And then this proposed budget will also go to Technical Citizens and Policy Advisory Committee, and any changes that come out of this meeting or the public information will be reflected in a updated, if you will, proposed final budget that will go to Administration and Finance at its May meeting and then onto the board for adoption in June.